The galaxy had been civilized by shortcuts. That was the first thing every schoolchild in the Conquered learned, whether they hatched in the ammonia cloisters of the Ool, budded in the gravity gardens of Sarath, or were decanted from the sacred nutrient vats of the Orath Dominion. Interstellar travel without a wormhole was possible in the same way carving a continent with a hand tool was possible. Given enough time, enough energy, enough stubbornness, yes, it could be done. But no sane species built a civilization that way. The wormholes were what mattered. They were the arteries of history. They linked star to star in stable throats of folded space, natural phenomena no species had learned to create and none had ever learned to destroy. Systems with wormhole mouths became centers of trade, faith, war, and law. Systems without them became backwaters, then mysteries, then blankness on maps. Over the ages, empires rose by finding new junctions, claiming them, fortifying them, and leaping outward again. A species that found a wormhole in its home system joined history. A species that did not remain local forever, trapped in the dark between the gates. So the maps of the galaxy were not maps in the old geometric sense. They were diagrams of accessibility. They showed what could be reached by reasonable means and ignored what could not. Colored clusters of inhabited systems hung in webs around major junction chains. Between those webs lay immense gulfs marked with gradients of uncertainty and a handful of survey notes. Sparse stars, no gate access, economically irrelevant. The emptiness between the gates was not truly empty, of course. It was merely too inconvenient to matter. That assumption had been sound for a very long time. Then humanity appeared. They did not arrive with a crusade fleet or a migration armada or a burst of frantic missionary broadcasts. They simply emerged from a minor wormhole junction at the edge of a middling trade corridor and introduced themselves with quiet politeness in three languages no one had ever heard before and one machine-translated trade pidgin that was bad but comprehensible. Their system registry listed 7 inhabited stars. Their diplomatic posture was cautious. Their visible fleets were modest. Their technology was respectable but unremarkable by the standards of the old powers. They traded precision machinery, exotic materials, compact fusion systems, and strangely efficient industrial control architectures. They bought cultural archives, pharmaceuticals, certain helium isotope catalysts, and legal access to updated stellar cartography. They listened far more than they spoke. They asked questions about tariffs, quarantine law, wormhole navigation conventions, and military exclusion zones. They declined most alliance proposals. They showed no hunger for religious argument, dynastic entanglement, or territorial theater. The great powers took their measure quickly. A young species, the analysts said, disciplined, clever, technically competent, a little hard to read, probably isolated until recently, probably still consolidating. 7 systems was not nothing, but it was nothing impressive either. A compact regional polity with a talent for industry and an unusual reserve. Something to watch, perhaps, not something to fear. The maps showed 7 human stars. The maps had never thought to look between them. Long before the first human diplomat shook a claw, tendril, or hand beyond their own expanding sphere, Saul had sat alone in a desert. That was not the name humans gave it at first. First they called it home, then cradle, then origin, then simply Saul again, as if old simplicity could survive scale. But among the archivists who later studied the shape of human history, the term that endured was wormhole desert. There were stars nearby, thousands upon thousands, rich enough in metals, volatiles, rocky planets, gas giants, comets, dust, and possibility. There was no shortage of places to go. There was only a shortage of doors. Within the first 100 light years, there were no known natural wormhole mouths. Within 200, none. Within 300, none that had usable stability by the time human probes found and characterized them. Saul and its neighbors had all the raw material for a civilization, and none of the miracle infrastructure on which the galaxy elsewhere had built its expectations. If humanity had been less stubborn, less restless, less unwilling to accept confinement, that would have been the end of the story. They would have turned inward forever and made of one system a paradise or a ruin. Instead, they built engines. The early years of expansion were slow enough to insult ambition. Robotic precursors went first, driven by laser sails, pellet beam arrays, fusion pulses, antimatter-catalyzed drives. Every method dreamed, prototyped, abandoned, and improved across centuries of iterative desperation. Some failed gloriously. Some succeeded barely. Some succeeded so well that later generations romanticized them and forgot how many engineers had gone gray making them reliable. The first interstellar probes took years to arrive and more years to report. The first seed ships took decades. The first human passengers committed themselves to journeys longer than the careers, marriages, and natural lives of the planners who launched them. Cryogenic systems reduced the burden but never eliminated it. Generation hulls emerged where biology, sociology, and engineering made them preferable. Uploaded minds traveled in hardened vaults on some routes. Embryo missions seeded others. Humanity tried everything because any single doctrine would have been too slow. They went first to the nearest useful stars, then the next ring beyond. A red dwarf with suitable metals and an outer ice belt became a refinery constellation. A brighter system with several rocky worlds and no convenient biosphere became a manufacturing complex. A dim, stable star with a handful of ugly but tractable planets became a testbed for atmosphere engineering. Many worlds were not settled at all in the planetary sense. They were occupied as systems, consumed as volumes, turned into networks of habitats, mirrors, collectors, spin cylinders, machine ecologies, and shipworks that made a planet seem almost quaint. Because travel was so difficult, every destination had to become self-sustaining quickly. That shaped everything. Humanity did not leap wide and thin. It rooted deep. Each new system received not just settlers but industry, and not just industry but the capacity to manufacture more industry. Seed factories built mines. Mines fed foundries. Foundries built additional factories, orbital yards, station clusters, power collectors, propellant depots, communication arrays. By the time large populations arrived in person, the skeletal economy of a system was often already alive, tended by layered supervisory AIs, expert systems, teleoperated machinery, and local machine cultures descended from earlier industrial control frameworks. The distances involved enforced patience and rewarded automation. A broken mine on Mars could once be repaired in hours. A broken mine around another star had to diagnose itself, print replacement parts, reassign drones, and petition for human review if the delay to await that review was acceptable at all. Ship traffic schedules could not depend on minute-to-minute improvisation across dozens of light years. They required prediction, delegation, hierarchy, and machine support of a sophistication that would have seemed like fantasy in earlier ages. Human beings remained in command. They always insisted on that politically, ethically, and symbolically. But command changed shape. A human council might approve the strategic development of 6 neighboring stars, while 10 million machine minds from narrow task architectures to broad adaptive fleet coordinators managed 1 trillion local decisions required to enact it. Human admirals set doctrine. Tactical intelligences fought the engagements. Human planners chose what to build. Industrial AIs allocated material flows, balanced energy budgets, and rewrote shipping timetables across months, years, and centuries. It was not elegant in the way outsiders later imagined. It was messy, contentious, patched with legal compromises and scar tissue from old accidents. There were labor disputes with machine guilds, resource crises, governance schisms, transit tragedies, and ideological wars over what counted as a person when minds could be forked, slowed, accelerated, embodied, or distributed. There were experiments that should never have left simulation and industries that ate more than they gave back. There were periods when the whole enterprise looked as if it might fracture into 100 incompatible civilizational branches. It did not fracture, or rather it fractured constantly and then reconnected, because isolation had trained humanity to value interoperability almost as much as survival. Standards bodies became more sacred than flags. Translation protocols mattered more than slogans. A habitat orbiting one star and a refinery swarm orbiting another might disagree on the philosophy of identity, but their cargo latches still had to mate, their software still had to exchange inventories, their emergency beacons still had to mean the same thing. Practicality became the grammar of civilization. Centuries passed, then millennia. Sol ceased to be central in any material sense, though it remained central in memory. Around scores of stars, then hundreds, human settlements thickened. Habitats multiplied until star systems resembled glittering dust clouds of intention. Asteroid belts dwindled into construction feedstock. Gas giants grew crowns of harvesting stations. Dark outer worlds became data sanctuaries, cryogenic vaults, and military reserve depots. Around brighter stars, mirror swarms and collector arrays multiplied into partial Dyson structures, then denser lattices, then clouds so intricate that later alien visitors compared them to weather made of mathematics. Every human child learned in some form the price of distance. It was present in everything. Shipping was expensive. Waste was sinful. Redundancy was wisdom. Local capacity was freedom. If a system could make it, store it, repair it, or grow it itself, it would. If it had to import a critical part from 15 light years away, then it needed a substitute design, a stockpile, and a contingency plan. The military logic followed naturally. No human navy grew around the idea of rushing from gate to gate in concentrated masses, because no gates existed. Fleets were distributed. Depots were layered deep. Mobile industry followed battle groups. Warships were designed for endurance measured in years, not days. Their crews were smaller than alien observers later expected, because automation handled much that other species delegated to living specialists. Their command systems were built to fight in communication environments where a central authority could not simply intervene every minute. Formations learned to think in intent, not instruction. This did not make humans warlike. Isolation had left them with too much work to romanticize conflict for long, but it made them difficult to surprise and harder still to uproot. By the time the first useful wormhole was found, humanity had already done what the rest of the galaxy considered economically absurd. They had crossed the void the slow way, again and again, until the slow way became normal. The discovery was almost anticlimactic. Survey vessels had spent centuries cataloging every anomaly that might someday matter. Most of those anomalies turned out to be dead ends, transient distortions, unstable spacetime pathologies, or things interesting only to physicists and very specialized insurers. This one, around a yellow-white star cataloged in the outer reaches of the expanding human sphere, was different. It had mass signatures that did not fit local bodies. It had gravitational lensing patterns that repeated with suspicious regularity. It had tidal effects on nearby dust and small bodies that resembled old theoretical wormhole models, preserved more from academic completeness than practical expectation. 3 automated probes vanished into the anomaly across 11 years. The 4th returned a ping from impossible coordinates. When the confirmation spread through the internal networks, whole worlds paused to watch. Humanity had found a gate. There was celebration, certainly. There was also a strain of discomfort, difficult to articulate but widely felt. The gate was what so many dreamers, expansionists, and impatient strategists had wished for. It was also proof that history elsewhere might have gone on without them for longer than any romantic narrative liked to admit. The first expeditions through were careful beyond parody. Sterility protocols nested within quarantine frameworks nested within legal regimes drafted by 12 jurisdictions and reviewed by machine advocates, xenobiologists, military planners, and insurance syndicates. Small vessels transited first, then drones, then a diplomatic corvette carrying experts, linguists, and a marine contingent that most of them hoped fervently would remain decorative. They emerged into a star system, occupied by structures unmistakably artificial and unmistakably not human. The first contact archives later became required study in nearly every human academy and many alien ones, not because the exchange itself was dramatic. It was, in truth, hesitant and awkward. What mattered was the mismatch of assumptions hidden inside every polite sentence. The local power at the far end of the gate, a compact mercantile polity called the Ithish Compact, assumed the newcomers were scouts from some newly gate-capable species. That was a reasonable assumption. The humans, despite all their internal complexity, had arrived through a wormhole and claimed only local jurisdiction around the mouth. When the Ithish asked for territory declarations in accordance with transit law, the human diplomats listed the systems attached to the newly opened route and a few nearby stars whose administration directly handled the corridor. When the Ithish requested maps, the humans provided star charts extending far beyond the gate network in all directions. The Ithish analysts treated the majority of those charts as exploratory notation, not sovereign depth, because no one in their experience built meaningful political coherence across such distances without gates. When the Ithish inquired how long humanity had been interstellar, the humans answered truthfully that they had been extrasolar for millennia. The compact translators rendered this as a probable cultural idiom or calendar mismatch, because a species isolated for millennia in a gate desert should have remained local. Thus the misunderstanding began almost invisibly and then hardened. Once the existence of humanity entered the wider records, the same pattern repeated. More neighbors appeared, more treaties were exchanged, more registries were filed. Every galactic institution asked for categorizations built around gate logic, number of connected systems, transit throughput, junction defenses, corridor dependencies, cluster associations. Humans answered in the required forms because that was the language of legitimacy. Those forms were not lies. They were just inadequate. Officially, humanity held 7 systems on the gate-accessible frontier. Unofficially, and to any human reading the same forms, the category itself was faintly ridiculous. 7 systems were merely the visible edge of a civilization that stretched behind the frontier like a continent behind a coastline. There were debates, naturally, about whether to correct the record. Some argued that honesty required a fuller declaration. Others pointed out that no galactic mechanism existed to register territory not anchored to wormhole graphs in any legally actionable way. Some warned that displaying the full extent of human industry to powers built around conquest might invite unnecessary alarm. Others said hiding would invite the same thing later under worse conditions. In the end, no grand deception was chosen because none was needed. Humanity simply did not volunteer a lecture on why everyone else's maps were conceptually broken. They traded, they observed, they learned. And the galaxy, seeing only what it had methods to see, underestimated them. Among all the powers that made this mistake, none made it with more certainty than the Orath Dominion. The Dominion called itself old, chosen, and obedient. Old it truly was. Chosen depended on whom one asked. Obedient was more complex, because what it obeyed had long ago ceased to be any single revelation and become instead an empire-sized apparatus of clergy fleet command, aristocratic military orders, ritual law, and sacred history stitched together by victory. To the Orath, wormholes were not merely natural phenomena. They were divine architecture, laid into the universe as proof that creation possessed intention. The sacred paths, their scriptures called them. To travel them was to walk roads prepared by the Maker. To govern them was not greed but stewardship. To seize them from the unworthy was not conquest but correction. Every empire justifies itself somehow. The Orath had merely had longer than most to refine the language. Their domain spread along a wide chain of gate corridors and subsidiary junctions. At each major node rose cathedral fortresses wrapped around transit control citadels. Their war fleets traveled under banners inscribed with liturgies visible in wavelengths most species never saw. Priests served beside gunnery officers. Planetary bombardment could be categorized as purification in the right legal context. Vassal states retained local customs if they paid tithes, accepted doctrinal supervision, and never forgot who held the sacred paths in trust. The Dominion was not the largest power in that quarter of the galaxy, but it was among the most feared. It had a habit of interpreting ambiguity as invitation. When human records entered Orath intelligence channels, analysts in black stone chambers and orbital strategy monasteries set to work. The files were not poor. They contained years of trade data, technological samples, diplomatic transcripts, industrial estimates, ship sightings, and testimony from merchants who had done business with the new species. It was enough to conclude several things correctly. Humans were cautious. Humans were technologically advanced in materials science, automation, and compact power systems. Humans produced military hardware of high quality. Humans did not yet understand the full political and spiritual order of the Gate network. Then the Orath analysts made their error. They evaluated human capacity through the same Gate-centric models they used for everyone else. 7 systems, modest visible fleet tonnage, frontier trade profile, no known major allied blocks, no demonstration of mass gate warfare. Their economic outputs, while impressive, could be explained by a highly industrialized compact polity. Their reserve strength was unknown, but assumed to scale within established norms. That assumption carried upward through bureaucracy until it reached doctrine and scripture. At the Synod of Ashen Transit, a senior cleric of the Path delivered the judgment that later entered history for all the wrong reasons. These newcomers, he proclaimed before admirals and prelates, sit upon a junction of the sacred architecture without submission, without reverence, and without rightful place in the hierarchies ordained by the Maker. Their claim is recent. Their reach is small. Their pride, however, is large enough to require remedy. The remedy proposed was elegant in its brutality. The human-held junction at the frontier would be brought into compliance. A crusade fleet would secure the gate, occupy the visible human systems, compel doctrinal acceptance or tributary status, and thereby regularize an unstable frontier. It would also serve, though this was not said in the public liturgies, as a demonstration to other minor powers that quiet reserve did not exempt one from the Dominion's attention. There were cautionary voices. Some merchants advised that the humans were more capable than they looked. Some military analysts noted that their shipping patterns suggested unusual depth of logistics. A particularly stubborn intelligence officer pointed out that no one had a satisfactory explanation for how a supposedly small species manufactured so much high-end hardware while keeping its visible systems so lightly trafficked. He was overruled. Civilizations built on a doctrine of chosenness do not enjoy anomalies. They interpret them away. While the Orath prepared sermons and war plans, humanity remained busy. That was another piece outsiders never quite believed even after the war. They imagined that hidden strength must have involved hidden tension, shadow fleets lurking in permanent readiness, conspiratorial councils waiting for their grand reveal. But great scale has its own banality. Much of human civilization on the eve of crisis was simply at work. Around a white star 57 light-years from the frontier gate, a maintenance guild coordinated mirror realignments in a partial Dyson lattice after a meteoroid cascade knocked 3,000 collectors out of their assigned resonances. Most of the task was performed by machine swarms and predictive control systems. The humans involved spent more time arbitrating priority disputes and safety margins than touching hardware. In a colder system rich in nickel-iron asteroids, kilometer-long warship hulls grew in assembly cradles under the supervision of tactical AI validators and old-fashioned union inspectors, who trusted no machine entirely where load-bearing welds were concerned. Bulk rail lines fed refined mass from shattered moons into foundries whose output schedules were booked years in advance. The yards did not advertise themselves to aliens because they had no reason to do so. They were one cluster among hundreds. Along freight routes invisible to every foreign map, convoy after convoy moved reaction mass, superconductors, habitat modules, cryogenic biovaults, replacement fusion bottle components, medicinals, cultural cargo, and the endless humble things without which civilization ceases to feel civilized. Coffee genomes, violin woods, algae strains, school archive mirrors, memorial sculpture blanks, seed corn edited for new gravities, pet licenses, wedding fabrics, machine lubricant, live coral for aquarium worlds, hard vacuum insulation panels, repair drones, commemorative whiskey. Logistics AIs balanced all of it at scales difficult to dramatize because they resembled competence rather than spectacle. 100 million shipping decisions here, 1,000 route optimizations there, strategic reserve calculations nested beneath civilian demand forecasts, beneath fleet readiness matrices. Those systems were descendants of the old desert years. They had been shaped by a civilization that survived only by never being late with essentials. At a naval command habitat called Hecate Ring, suspended in the dark beyond a gas giant's magnetosphere, officers reviewed updated gate proximity defense drills, while tactical machine advisors ran scenario trees that branched into quadrillions of possible engagements and discarded nearly all of them as irrelevant. The meetings were calm. Everyone knew the Orath were making threatening noises. Everyone also knew that the visible frontier had little resemblance to the actual strategic depth behind it. The question was not whether humanity could defend the gate systems. The question was how much of themselves they wanted to reveal in doing so. Admiral Elena Varga chaired one of those discussions from an understated room with a window wall facing shipyards, so large that even at that distance, they resembled a second artificial horizon. Diplomatic channels, she asked. A legal advisor raised 2 fingers. Still open, still escalating in rhetoric. Their latest note uses the phrase sacred custodianship 8 times. A younger officer, born in a habitat where bluntness passed for courtesy, said, "That sounds like they're going to invade us with theology." "That," said Varga, "is an old military tradition. A tactical intelligence manifested as a soft lattice of light above the table, voice neutral. Probability of an Orath coercive deployment within local gate-relevant timescale has risen to 62%. Probability of a full annexation attempt remains below 50, but increasing. Visible force posture, Varga asked. Current frontier arrays are sufficient to contest entry, but not to annihilate a concentrated crusade fleet without reinforcement. The younger officer frowned. Then we should reinforce. We are reinforcing, Varga said. He understood a second later and sat back. On a human map, reinforcement did not mean moving a dramatic fleet through a gate for foreign observers to count. It meant shifting schedules across a sphere, waking reserve crews, adjusting patrol vectors, loading magazines in systems no Orath intelligence had ever heard named, and beginning the long inward tide toward the frontier. The order was already spreading, in forms subtle and immense. At one shipyard, maintenance downtimes on a line of escort carriers were delayed 6 weeks. At a depot world, antimatter catalyst output was diverted from civilian freight reserves to fleet allocations. At 3 training stations, cadets on simulation rotations were advanced into live readiness pipelines. At distant anchorages, Dormant drone barges accepted activation keys and began spinning up combat software from cold storage. Across 100 stars, nothing looked dramatic. Across 1,000, it was mobilization. And still most human citizens noticed it only as a slight shift in available shipping slots and a rise in security chatter on local feeds. The Orath, by contrast, preferred theater. Their crusade fleet gathered in a sanctified mustering system, whose primary world bore continent-spanning basilicas and launched spires visible from orbit as lines of gold and obsidian. Pilgrims watched from station balconies as warships lit drives in synchronized processions. Choirs sang into the vacuum over carrier broadcasts. Priests anointed command hulls with atomized oils before sealing the liturgical apertures. Each vessel received a rite of purpose. Each marine formation received absolution in advance. The fleet was formidable by the standards of Gate War. 800 major warships, 30 heavy carriers, troop tenders, supply priests, purification barges, line escorts, and bombardment platforms enough to reduce a stubborn world to a sermon written in glass. Their admirals did not expect all that force to be necessary. That was not the point. A crusade was a message as much as a campaign. Intelligence estimates remained confident. Human visible military strength in the Gate cluster was rated at fewer than 200 true combatants, perhaps double that with auxiliaries and defense platforms. Their industrial sophistication suggested they could replace losses efficiently, but replacement was irrelevant if the Gate was taken quickly and the visible system subdued in sequence. The expected timetable for compliance was 23 days. The expected timetable for unconditional victory was 6 weeks. Those projections were distributed to observers, allies, neutral trade houses, and internal ministries, because confidence loves an audience. The first human response to the final Orath ultimatum disappointed everyone hopping for drama. It was brief, formal, and almost offensively restrained. Humanity, it said, recognized no religious claim over natural transit phenomena. Human-administered systems would remain under human administration. Any unauthorized military entry would be resisted. Diplomatic channels remained open. No florid threats, no boasting, no theatrical display of mobilization. In several Orath command circles, that restraint was taken not as discipline but as fear. The Crusade fleet entered the wormhole on schedule. Transit through a stable gate is difficult to narrate because every species invents metaphors and none of them are correct. The Orath spoke of passing through the maker's breath. Human physicists preferred equations. The practical experience for those aboard the ships was a brief interval of impossible geometry, sensor distortion, internal field strain, and then the abrupt reassertion of normal local space around another star. The crusade emerged in ordered waves. The human-held system on the far side was designated Meridian in local records, though Orath liturgy had already renamed its sanctified threshold. It was a respectable star, yellow-orange, with a dense field of orbital infrastructure around its fourth planet and heavy industrial signatures in the outer belt. To Orath eyes it looked exactly like what they expected from a regional frontier capital. Active, developed, but not extraordinary. Then the minds woke. Human defense doctrine at Gates was built around delay, shaping, and information denial. Meridian's orbital space erupted with guided kill vehicles, autonomous missile clouds, laser nests hidden in innocuous station masses, and kinetic batteries embedded in ore processing platforms that had spent years pretending to be nothing but ore processing platforms. The first Orath wave lost 17 ships before it completed deployment geometry. The second lost 12 more, and a troop carrier gutted by a relativistic impactor that had been waiting cold in deep shadow for 9 months. The Orath adapted quickly. They were not fools, merely arrogant. Counter-battery fire shredded human fixed emplacements. Carrier screens fanned out. Their heavy ships established layered point defense and began methodical suppression of local fortifications. Boarding craft took two outer stations. A purification platform bracketed a shipyard cluster and reduced 3 civilian yards and everything in them to incandescent fragments. Human local forces fought hard, then fell back. To the Orath commanders, this looked like confirmation. Resistance was fierce but limited, exactly what a small but competent polity would offer at its frontier. They had weathered the first sting. The gate remained open behind them. Their formations were stabilizing. Meridian's central orbital shell could be reduced in hours. Then the long-range pics began reporting contacts. At first the numbers were small enough to ignore. Heat blooms in the outer dark, inbound vectors from above the ecliptic, a scatter of drive signatures emerging from sensor uncertainty. Local reserves, one Orath captain said dismissive. Then the tactical displays revised. 200 inbound became 400, then 900, then more. Their approach vectors made no sense under gate war assumptions. They were not transiting the wormhole. They were not even arriving from any single direction. They were descending into the system from the black between stars on trajectories that implied origins scattered all across surrounding space. An Orath sensor officer stared at her board, then at the numbers, then at her board again as if a fence itself might cause the contacts to retract. "Impossible," she said. Her commander demanded classification. The ship's tactical choir AI, usually placid, answered with an edge of strain. Drive profiles non-Orath, probable human, numbers increasing. How, the commander snapped. From where? The machine, lacking ego, answered simply. Interstellar space. Across the Crusade fleet, confusion spread faster than orders. Admirals called for revised maps. Priests demanded composure. Intelligence officers, with every reason to fear for their careers, began assembling a truth they should have reached years before. Meridian was not the edge of human space. It was a gate system embedded within human space. That distinction, invisible on every galactic chart, was the difference between raiding a border and driving uninvited into the middle of a continent. The first reinforcement groups were not even the main body. They were local response flotillas from nearby human stars, the equivalent of district constables arriving with enough firepower to break an empire's assumptions. Fast attack destroyers, autonomous missile tenders, escort carriers wrapped in drone clouds, mobile beam platforms, command frigates whose tactical AIs began stitching the growing battlespace into a single coherent model the instant they dropped into engagement range. They hit the Orath flanks before the Crusade could reorient. More contacts poured inward behind them. Hours earlier, those ships had been anonymous entries in a logistics network, convoy diversions, reserve activations, reaction mass expenditures approved by distant quartermasters. Now they were visible, unavoidable fact. Thousands of human warships moving in converging layers from stars the Orath had never counted. At the center of Meridian's surviving defense grid, Admiral Varga arrived aboard the command carrier, Resolute, accompanied by a screen so dense the local tactical net had to widen scale 3 times to display it meaningfully. Her first act was not to make a speech. It was to ask for a civilian casualty update, then for ore trajectory deconfliction in the outer belt, then for permission to execute containment pattern 4. Permission, as it happened, was largely ceremonial. By the time the request propagated through the distributed legal and strategic authorities, Pattern 4 was already unfolding. Human fleet doctrine in the desert years had been built for battles that might sprawl across light towers while participants operated under delayed intent. When adapted to a single system with excellent local communications and AI-assisted synchronization, it became something close to orchestral violence. The Orath fought in proud lines and sacred wedges. Their formations emphasized mutual support, frontal dominance, and the moral weight of visible battle order. Human formations dissolved and reformed continuously. A carrier group was not a shape but a set of relationships. A destroyer screen was a moving theorem. Drone swarms peeled off, self-assigned, fused sensor input, and attacked weak points with unnerving indifference to attrition. Kinetic launch platforms lofted kills across trajectories planned not just for interception, but for debris management hours later. Beam ships used each other's targeting solutions in distributed chains. Reserve flotillas arrived and slotted into the larger whole with the frictionless precision of a civilization that had spent millennia teaching machines how to turn distance into routine. The Orath had expected one battle. Instead, they found themselves inside a system-scale ecosystem of war. At first, their admirals tried to preserve initiative. Heavy battleships pushed toward Meridian's inner orbital shell, intending to seize decisive terrain before reinforcement numbers became unmanageable. Human torpedo clusters gutted 3 of them. Orath carriers launched marine boarding waves against local defense stations, only to find those stations already evacuated, their apparent command corps' decoys masking magazines rigged for remote detonation. A purification barge deployed to target Meridian's 4th planet and was intercepted by 6 autonomous strike craft that rammed through its layered shields in a sequence so precisely timed it looked choreographed. From the flagship Sanctifier of Dawn, High Admiral Kelter demanded strategic updates every 40 seconds. "They are committing their reserve," he said with controlled contempt as new red icons flooded the displays. His chief analyst, who had not slept in 31 hours and now looked like a creature flensed by comprehension, said, "Excellency, this cannot be reserve." Kelter turned one eye ridge toward him. "Explain." The analyst swallowed. "Their arrival vectors imply local origin stars in multiple shells around the system, not along the gate chain, in normal space. We have no registry of those systems because no registry exists. We assess them by gate visibility only." Meaning, Excellency, we do not know how much of them there is. That answer haunted the remaining Orath survivors for the rest of their lives, because it marked the moment the war changed from campaign to revelation. Humanity's hidden scale was not merely quantitative. It was conceptual. The Orath knew how to count ships emerging from gates. They did not know how to think about a polity whose strategic depth was measured in volumes of ordinary space instead of transit nodes. Every incoming contact from the dark was therefore not only another tactical problem, but another crack in doctrine itself. The human reinforcements continued. From nearby stars came the immediate responders. From deeper within the sphere came heavier elements. Battleships designed for endurance rather than parade emerged from weeks of hard burn and plunged into Meridian's combat envelope, already linked to the battlespace by predictive tactical meshes. Mobile factories and ammunition tenders followed in protected echelons. Drone supercarriers released clouds so vast that Orath point defense officers reported them at first as sensor weather. Hospital ships, repair barges, salvage directives, legal review packets, press blackouts, civilian evacuation corridors, all of it flowed in behind the guns because that was how human war worked. It was not a momentary surge of fury. It was industry deciding to express itself violently. The Orath line began to buckle. An empire built on faith in ordained order has trouble when order visibly abandons it. Some crews fought harder as the tide turned, convinced that martyrdom redeemed miscalculation. Others looked at the expanding human signatures and understood, with a cold clarity beyond panic, that they had marched a ceremonial army into the logistics core of a giant. The cruiser Spear of Contrition tried to break for the gate and was caught in a crossfire of beam destroyers that stripped its shields, sliced through drive housings, and left it tumbling in silence. The carrier Pilgrim's fire launched every remaining strike craft in a desperate saturation run against Resolute, and succeeded only in revealing the density of human defensive drones, which shredded the attack in nested layers so efficiently that later analysts used the footage in training simulators under the title Futility as a weapon. Human losses mounted too, though less publicly. Meridian's orbital cities had taken hits. Civilian yards burned. Thousands died in decompression, fire, and impact events before evacuation control could catch up. Several human flotillas arriving too aggressively were mauled by Orath heavies that still knew how to kill. A command frigate vanished with all hands after a magazine cascade. A whole cloud of defense drones was sacrificed to blunt a bombardment spread that would otherwise have reached a population ring. Admiral Varga watched the losses arrive as numbers and names, never allowing herself the luxury of abstraction. On her command deck, the tactical displays showed beauty, if one liked the harsh beauty of solutions converging. The casualty lists showed cost. She had no intention of forgiving the Orath for either. "Status on gate containment?" she asked. A machine voice answered. "Outer exclusion shell established. 73% confidence no major crusade elements can withdraw without unacceptable additional losses." "Additional," a staff captain muttered. The AI, incapable of sarcasm but fluent in context, said, "For them." Varga considered a pursuit authorization into the gate for exactly 8 seconds, then rejected it. Human strategic doctrine did not punish surprise with strategic recklessness. Meridian had been attacked. Meridian would be secured. Beyond that came politics, not impulse. "Break them here," she said. "No sermons, no chase." The order propagated. What followed at Meridian entered military history across the galaxy, not because it was the largest battle ever fought, though by local tonnage it ranked disturbingly high, but because it was the first time the old powers saw what a civilization built without gates could bring to bear in a single place once sufficiently provoked. Human AIs did not replace admirals, they amplified them. They parsed sensor floods, predicted maneuver envelopes, assigned drone kills, fused electronic warfare, and managed friendly fire constraints at speeds living officers could never match. Human commanders, freed from drowning in detail, did what humans remained very good at: choosing priorities under moral pressure, recognizing when a machine-optimal solution was politically poisonous, exploiting adversary psychology, and deciding where to be merciful. The mercy at Meridian was limited. Orath bombardment platforms were prioritized for total destruction. Carrier groups were isolated and dismembered. Any vessel transmitting active targeting locks on civilian habitats was marked for immediate kill. Boarding craft approaching evacuation lanes were erased before their crews understood they had been seen. By the 7th hour after the first reinforcements arrived, the Crusade fleet had lost cohesion. By the 10th, it had lost any plausible avenue to victory. By the 12th, it was a scattering of stubborn clusters, trapped hulks, retreat attempts, and ships trying to preserve local honor in the face of universal arithmetic. High Admiral Kelter made one final broadcast to his surviving captains. "The path is proven by endurance," he said, voice ragged under compartment alarms. "Hold the threshold. The unordained cannot." The transmission ended there as Sanctifier of Dawn took a spinal impact from a human kinetic lance, accelerated over a trajectory so long and carefully masked that the warning arrived a fraction of a second after the strike. The Orath flagship broke from the center outward, fragments blooming in hard white light. After that, organized resistance lasted 19 more minutes. The survivors surrendered in pockets, fled toward the gate and died, or drifted powerless until human recovery craft reached them with weapons trained and medical protocols already queued. When the guns at last quieted, Meridian looked like every victorious battlefield has always looked, less triumphant in person than in retrospect. Wreckage shone everywhere. Rescue lights flickered over torn habitats. Fire control drones moved through vaporized decks searching for life signs among the dead. Automated tugs nudged dangerous debris out of collision paths. Salvage jurists began the tedious future work of assigning legal identity to fragments of empire. Only then did the wider galaxy begin to understand what had happened. News moved first as rumor because rumor can outrun doctrine. Traders whispered that the Orath crusade had failed, then that it had been destroyed, then that it had been destroyed by a human fleet too large to count, then by 10 fleets, then by reinforcements arriving from impossible directions. Sensor logs leaked. Merchant recorders corroborated. Emergency transmissions from surviving Orath vessels were intercepted, translated, and circulated through half the Concord before censors even decided whose censors should object. Everywhere people pulled up maps. Everywhere the maps failed them. How many human systems were there really? No one knew. The old gate registries were useless. Survey probes that had once dismissed interstitial regions as economically irrelevant were suddenly tasked with revisiting centuries of assumptions. Trade houses realized their estimates of human productive capacity had been laughably low. Strategic institutes revised one another's projections upward in panicked increments. Border states along apparently empty voids wondered, for the first time, whether those voids were empty at all. Humanity did not help the confusion immediately. Their post-battle statement was concise. The Orath Crusade fleet had entered human-administered space without authorization and conducted attacks against civilian and military targets. It had been defeated. Human rescue operations were ongoing for all survivors regardless of species. Further incursions would be resisted. Diplomatic channels remained open to any authority capable of sincerity. The statement included no fleet numbers. It did include, appended almost as an afterthought, a revised legal memo on the definition of territorial depth in non-gate space. Scholars would spend decades arguing whether that footnote was a masterpiece of understated menace or merely a very human joke. The Orath Dominion received the survivors of Meridian in silence. Silence, in that case, did not mean calm. It meant institutions breaking decorum because no sanctioned language yet existed for what had occurred. Priests demanded to know why the sacred paths had delivered judgment to the faithful. Admirals demanded to know how intelligence had failed so completely. Intelligence demanded, bitterly and in private, why no one had listened when they pointed at anomalies years earlier. Vassal states began sending exquisitely worded messages of concern that all translated, under the surface, into the same question: can you still protect us? Retaliation was discussed. Retaliation died under arithmetic. To strike back effectively, the Dominion would need to concentrate larger fleets, gather better intelligence, and identify actual human centers of gravity. The first was possible at cost. The second would take time. The third proved almost offensively difficult. Human space had no single obvious vulnerable chain of gate nodes to sever because the gate nodes were not the basis of its cohesion. Its industries were distributed, redundant, and buried in a volume of stars most Dominion planners had never considered strategically relevant. War against such a power was not impossible, but it was no longer a crusade. It was a generational conflict against an adversary whose logistics culture had been trained by distances the Dominion still treated as empty background. Practicality at last overcame doctrine. Under neutral mediation, negotiations began. The first human delegation to meet the Orath after Meridian did not arrive with threats. They arrived with casualty ledgers, debris analyses, records of bombardment against civilian targets, and a meticulous demand package that mixed reparations, transit guarantees, prisoner exchange terms, non-interference clauses, and doctrinally neutral language about mutual recognition of sovereignty. It was crushing precisely because it avoided humiliation for its own sake. Humanity did not need grand revenge. Reality had already handled spectacle. A famous exchange from those negotiations survived in 3 independent transcripts. An Orath cleric, voice stiff with contained rage, asked the human lead envoy, "Why conceal the true extent of your domain?" The envoy, an older woman whose professional calm had terrified more than one boardroom before she ever saw an alien, answered, "We did not conceal it. You built your politics around things we considered local infrastructure and assumed the rest did not matter." The cleric replied, "No civilization spans such distances coherently." The envoy looked at him for a long moment and said, "We did." That sentence circulated almost as widely as the battle footage. The formal settlement recognized human sovereignty over their gate systems, and by implication, though not yet with fully adequate cartography, the surrounding non-gate regions under effective administration. The Orath paid reparations in material, access concessions, and transit rights. Several captive minor powers under Orath spiritual supervision discovered in the wake of the humiliation that supervision could be renegotiated. The Dominion did not collapse, but it shrank inward from certainty. More importantly, the galactic order changed. The Conquered convened an extraordinary cartographic summit, which sounded boring until one understood that maps are compressed arguments about power. For the first time in common history, serious institutions began drawing territory not just as gate-linked clusters but as actual stellar volumes. The resulting charts were ugly at first. Blobbed regions, uncertainty shells, probabilistic sovereignties. They offended old sensibilities. They were also more real. Survey funding poured into interstitial exploration. Whole academic fields woke up overnight. Economists recalculated trade theories that had treated non-gate transit as marginal. Military colleges added mandatory courses on deep space logistics. Merchant houses scrambled to sign long-haul agreements with human carriers, whose route planning software abruptly became the most desired technology in known space. Politicians from powers bordering empty expanses started sending increasingly polite inquiries into whether any humans might, perhaps, live nearby. In answer, humanity did what it had always done. They went back to work. Meridian was rebuilt. The damaged habitats spun again. The wreckage fields became salvage estates, memorial sites, and engineering case studies. New stations rose where old ones had died, more heavily armored and less aesthetically trusting. Fleet schedules gradually relaxed from wartime surge to peacetime density. Convoys resumed carrying the humble necessities of civilization alongside the elegant and the strategic. Children in systems that had never seen an alien learned new languages, because now there was reason to. Museums commissioned galleries titled Before the Maps Changed and After. Humanity did not rush to conquer anyone. That disappointed some frightened observers and reassured others. They had no need to demonstrate domination through expansion along the gate network. They had already proven the point more deeply. The galaxy's old powers had mistaken visible access for actual scope. Humanity's mere existence corrected that error. For the Orath, the correction became theological whether they wished it or not. Some hardened into denial, claiming Meridian a test of faith. Others quietly reinterpreted Scripture to accommodate the possibility that the Maker had also sanctified the wilderness between the paths. A few younger officers, more practical than pious, began studying human logistics with the same intensity their predecessors had reserved for sacred text. History, after all, tends to humble those who insist it has already ended. Years later, when the first truly comprehensive multispecies map of that galactic quadrant was unveiled, crowds gathered in public halls, private studies, station plazas, monastery observatories, and market feeds to watch. The old gate network still shone, familiar and important, a lacework of civilization stretching across the stars. But now, around and between those strands, new color spread across regions once left pale and unnamed. Human space did not look like any previous empire. It did not form a neat chain. It did not cling to the wormholes like moss on a wall. It filled volume. It occupied depth. Across thousands of stars, from Sol in its ancient desert to the frontier gates where others had first noticed them, humanity appeared not as a fringe polity but as a long-grown sphere of inhabited, industrialized intention. Somewhere in that unveiled geometry lay the true lesson of meridian. The great civilizations of the galaxy had spent ages mastering the roads they were given. They had built miracles upon the certainty of shortcuts and mistaken that certainty for the shape of reality itself. They had called the spaces between the roads empty because emptiness was cheaper than imagination. Humanity had been born where there were no roads. So they had crossed the dark anyway, slowly, stubbornly, system by system, year by year, century by century, until the wilderness ceased to be wilderness and became home. And when the galaxy finally came looking for the little species with 7 stars and quiet manners, it discovered not a frontier holding, but a civilization that had spent thousands of years learning how to become vast, without asking the universe for convenience first.